A bipartisan rebuke to the president today. The Senate today voted 59-41 to terminate the president's national emergency declaration to build a border wall. That's a hell of a throw for him. 59 against him. 12 Republicans voted with the Democrats. Let's watch.
The use of national emergency powers to circumvent Congress's explicit decision on funding is unprecedented.
This declaration is a dangerous precedent.
It's a question about the balance of power that is core to our Constitution.
We must stand up and defend Congress's institutional powers as the framers intended that we would.
Well, minutes after the vote, the president tweeted the word veto. He followed up later today, writing, "I look forward to vetoing the just-passed Democrat-inspired," notice how they use the word Democrat, not Democratic, "inspired resolution which would open borders while increasing crime, drugs, and traffic in our country. I thank all the strong Republicans who voted to support border security and our desperately needed wall."
What's happening, guys? Welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. So let's get started. 59 senators voted to kill Trump's border wall emergency declaration. 12 of them Republicans who crossed party lines to join every Democrat in the chamber. It forced a presidential veto, the only thing standing between Trump and the complete collapse of his top domestic priority. This isn't ancient history.
Two-thirds vote in both the House and the Senate is needed to override the veto. I'm joined now by Phil Rucker, White House Bureau Chief of the Washington Post, and Charlie Sykes, Editor-in-Chief of the Bulwark. Thank you both. I'll go to Charlie first on this. The Republican, it was like in the spring you start seeing grass growing up in the cracks in the cement, you start seeing little sprouts coming through the cement. Now, I don't think Trump likes to see those sprouts, but there they were today, 12 Republican sprouts, including the 3 people with some brains in that caucus, including, I have to say, Toomey as well, the ones that seem to be principled. They jumped out and said, no, this is the wrong way to go. Too much power for a president.
Yeah, this was a very strong rebuke. And yeah, this is a very strong rebuke of the president. And 12 senators breaking with the president is certainly a beginning of something. But it could have been bigger, and it should have been bigger. I think there are a lot of senators who understood this was an easy vote. This was a red line vote. And yet they chose to cave in. They chose to go along with the White House rather than the Constitution.
I mean, why did Tom Tillis break?
Very disappointing.
It's a documented, verified precedent for what actually happens when Congress stops tweeting outrage and starts pulling the constitutional levers the founders gave them to strangle executive overreach. We need to settle in and absorb the full gravitational weight of this account because it is the complete documented chronicle of how Congress kills unlawful orders. Every spine-tingling detail is anchored in actual recorded votes cast by actual named members in the most formally verified accountability format history can provide.
Tom Tillis is afraid of a primary. You have Ben Sasse, who's up for re-election. You have Ted Cruz, who now can no longer be taken seriously as a constitutional conservative. You have I think you have a lot of other Republican senators who really held their nose, and I think are going to pay a price in terms of their reputation for going against what they had said. I mean, a lot of these guys are on the record, on tape, denouncing Obama's use of executive authority, and their hypocrisy was really on display. And also, quite frankly, their spinelessness was on display as well.
Well said. Let's take a look at Ted Cruz and how he views executive authority differently than when the Democrats in the White House. Let's watch.
We, the Senate, are waiting in our duty to stop this lawless administration.
The 59-41 termination vote for the border wall emergency, featuring those 12 Republican defectors, is locked into the permanent record. The forced presidential veto that blocked the congressional override is locked into the permanent record. The war powers resolutions demanding ironclad legislative authorization.
Well, today he said in a statement against the resolution that current law empowers the president to declare a national emergency. And he's not the only one seeing things differently, Cruz isn't. Differently now that they did back in 2014. When President Obama took executive action on immigration. Let's watch the difference.
If President Obama acts in defiance of the people and imposes his will on the country, Congress will act. The Senate should not be in the business of misusing specific resolutions to express opinions on more general matters.
This president, if he doesn't get his way, says, I got a pen, I got a phone, I'm going to go it alone. Well, that's a disaster waiting to occur.
Congress has granted
the president the authority to do exactly what he's doing.
What he did is a dangerous precedent, and if he has the power to do that, what could a Republican do regarding laws they don't like? But I think the president's on solid legal footing, and his veto will be sustained.
Before any further military escalation, hitting a 52-47 passage on Venezuela, with 5 Republicans, including Hawley, Young, Murkowski, Collins, and Paul siding with Democrats, is locked into the permanent record. The Iran War Powers resolutions, scraping shockingly close at 47-48 near misses, is locked into the permanent record.
Well, it seems to me there were 3 Republicans there that showed some principle today. That was Romney, of course, and Portman, and Alexander. There's the thing I think of as principled people. And you throw in Pat Toomey, but how many hacks do we got in the Senate on the Republican side now that were willing to just bow to this guy?
Well, the senators who voted with Trump today are afraid of Trump. That's why they voted that way, Ted Cruz included. And it came after a week of pretty intensive lobbying on the part of the White House to try to get enough Republicans in line. Vice President Pence was meeting with senators. President Trump was personally calling lawmakers over the weekend and this week. It was a very top priority for Trump because this was his signature campaign issue, and he felt a vote with the Democrats here would be a betrayal by his own party.
When you talk, Charlie, when you talk around, do you sense that this is I think it was a Steve Allen song, this is the start of something big? I mean, could this be something starting big in terms of a mutiny, or is it a one-off, today's vote?
Lawmakers and governors banding together to scream for tariff legislation requiring congressional sign-off after the Supreme Court ruling is locked into the permanent record. The combined judicial decisions slamming the door on tariff schemes while working in tandem with legislative pressure to slice away at unilateral economic authority is documented across multiple credible outlets. Every vote number has a formal resting place in the archives.
Well, I think it's a crack. I think your analogy of the grass growing up in the sidewalk is probably better. But this is the second vote. I mean, think about it. He's going to issue 2 vetoes because this Republican Senate also rebuked him on the war in Yemen. So you're starting to see a little bit of independence. Also, you know, I mean, yeah, these guys are afraid of primaries, particularly people like Tom Tillis. But there are going to be people on the ballot next year who I think are going to regret this as well. And so I think on some of these issues, you're starting to see a little bit of independence. And, you know, again, I'm glad the 12 senators voted against this emergency declaration. But still, when you think about it, there's not a single conservative Republican in that Senate who does not know in their heart that that this is wrong, that they've crossed a red line here, that they put the politics and their loyalty to Trump over their Constitution and their oath of office.
Phil, this is a strangely Napoleonic kind of Republican leader. I mean, it's not a leader like Reagan, who shared an ideology with so many Republicans, anti-communism, less government, less taxes, and they seem to share that.
Every single name of a Republican crossover is authenticated, and the synthesis creates the most chillingly comprehensive picture of formally exercised congressional constitutional authority in the most multiplied, documented, and credibly sourced institutional accountability record we possess. The veto-forcing reality of the border wall emergency resolution is the most nakedly revealing element of this entire saga, because it demonstrates that the 59-vote congressional termination was not a mere messaging exercise.
In their souls, they really were the same party. This is one boss telling everybody every day how he wants it done that day, and you obey. And this time we see 12 people not obeying. And I guess the question is, again, back to this, are we seeing that fear unraveling?
Well, they're obeying because President Trump still commands such extraordinarily high support within the Republican base. Republican voters overwhelmingly support Trump. We see that in poll after poll after poll. And there's not a clean ideology. It's not like he's enacting a party agenda. He's enacting a Trump agenda with the Trump ideology that changes from issue to issue to issue. And these senators are just trying to hang on and preserve their own political lives. But one thing that's important about this unraveling that you're talking about is it wasn't just the senators we would have expected to betray Trump today, Romney, Collins, Murkowski, but you saw Rob Portman of Ohio, Marco Rubio of Florida, Roy Blunt of Missouri. These are pretty kind of middle-of-the-road Republicans who ordinarily have been voting with the president.
And they look like survivors to me. In fact, they look like people that are going to survive Trump. Anyway, thank you.
It was so consequential, so heavy with institutional menace, that it demanded the most dramatic presidential constitutional response possible in the most most institutionally significant format available to a cornered executive. A presidential veto slamming down against a congressional emergency termination resolution is the real-world manifestation of fundamental constitutional separation of powers tension at its breaking point. It specifically establishes that the president assess the congressional accountability action as sufficiently devastating to his grip on power that he was forced to resort to the most extreme individual executive resistance encoded in the Constitution. When a president vetoes a congressional emergency termination resolution, he is publicly and specifically acknowledging that without that veto, the most consequential available congressional override of his most signature executive emergency power claim would have formally and legally taken effect, stripping him of the very authority he seized. Forcing a presidential veto is the specifically consequential kill action by Congress precisely because its character requires that dramatic executive response. It is the formally alarming confirmation that fundamental congressional constitutional authority was most specifically and formally exercised in its most urgently pressing emergency power accountability format. The 12 Republican crossovers form the politically atomic individual dimension of this termination vote. They demand careful, almost forensic treatment as the most specifically consequential bipartisan signal whose character directly establishes that the primary challenge enforcement mechanism, the threat of a primary from the right, could not prevent the most dramatic available Republican Senate accountability break when the most fundamental constitutional separation of powers concern was directly and specifically implicated. 12 Republican senators crossing a president on his most signature border policy priority is not a peripheral defection on some forgettable procedural matter. This is the most specifically alarming core policy Republican crossover in the formally documented institutional accountability record, and its specific combined vote total of 59 most directly approaches the consequentially critical 67 threshold. That threshold is the ultimate calculation in constitutional override removal mathematics, the final boss of Senate accountability. 12 Republicans producing 59 total is the specifically alarming bipartisan accountability signal, and its specific approach to the 67 threshold is the formally alarming near supermajority signal in the credibly documented constitutional accountability record. The money reprogramming reassertion aspect slams into the fiscal heart of the Congress kills unlawful orders narrative. It demands analysis as the most formally available expression of fundamental Congressional Appropriations Clause authority being specifically asserted against the most aggressive presidential fund reprogramming in the formally documented accountability context. Lawmakers pushing measures to claw back control over how presidents slosh money around after an attempt to reprogram defense and disaster funds. Solo is the specific congressional accountability response to a direct appropriations clause violation in the formally alarming constitutional authority dimension. The Appropriations Clause vests the fundamental power of the purse in Congress, not in the executive branch, and any presidential attempt to reprogram congressional appropriations without explicit congressional authorization is a direct constitutional violation in the formally available separation of powers accountability analysis. Reprogramming defense and disaster funds without authorization is that violation made manifest. Congressional measures specifically reasserting grip over presidential money movement are the formally available constitutional authority response to fundamental fiscal overreach in the credibly documented institutional record. We need to get deep into the full architecture here, because there are three specific dimensions of the Trump power ends after Congress kills unlawful order paradigm that each demand rigorous and detailed unpacking. The first dimension is the constitutional tools analysis, understanding what the specific available congressional mechanisms, including resolutions, funding limits, and new statutes, most precisely mean for the realistic congressional capacity to kill the most unlawful presidential orders in the formally available separation of powers accountability framework. The second dimension is the chips away at the aura mechanism, comprehending what the specific documented pattern of bipartisan votes against the most aggressive executive orders means for the fundamental psychological dynamic sustaining complete Republican Party loyalty to unlawful presidential power claims. The third dimension is the will they use their tools question, grasping what the documented pattern of past congressional accountability action most precisely means for the realistic near-term congressional response to continuing unlawful executive power claims in the urgently pressing second-term accountability context. Let us strip each one down to its core. The constitutional tools analysis comes first because it is the essential analytical foundation for the entire Congress kills unlawful order architecture. Understanding precisely what specific constitutional weapons Congress has formally available to kill unlawful presidential orders, and why these tools are the fundamental constitutional accountability mechanisms rather than some dramatic extraordinary measures, is critical within a rigorously applied separation of powers accountability framework. The Congressional resolution is the most immediately available mechanism for terminating specific presidential emergency declarations under the National Emergencies Act. Its specific statutory machinery allows Congress to pass a joint resolution of termination that directly cancels the specifically identified presidential emergency declaration in the formally available statutory accountability format. The documented 59-vote border wall emergency termination is the specifically available real-world deployment of exactly that fundamental statutory accountability mechanism in the most formally consequential presidential emergency declaration accountability context we have ever witnessed. The funding limit is the specifically fiscal tool through which Congress can most directly prevent executive branch implementation of the most unlawful presidential orders by specifically denying the fundamental appropriated funds required for that implementation, leveraging the formally available Appropriations Clause accountability mechanism. The new statute is the broadly available legislative tool through which Congress can most specifically and formally override the most aggressive executive branch interpretation of existing statutory authority by directly clarifying congressional authorization in ways that specifically and formally eliminate the most creative executive emergency authority interpretation in the formally available legislative accountability format. Resolution plus funding limit plus new statute is the comprehensively available constitutional toolkit. Its specific character as the most fundamental rather than the most extraordinary constitutional accountability mechanism is the formally alarming signal of how readily available the most consequential congressional kill action actually is when enough members unite in the urgently pressing accountability context. The War Powers Republican crossover breadth analysis is the specifically alarming individual dimension of the Congress kills unlawful order saga beyond the border wall emergency precedent. It demands scrutiny as the formally authenticated bipartisan accountability signal whose specific ideological breadth across the available Republican spectrum most directly establishes the realistic future expansion pathway in the consequentially documented institutional record. The five named Republican Venezuela war powers crossover, spanning from Hawley's ultra-nationalist positioning through Paul's libertarian isolationism, through Young, Murkowski, and Collins's institutionalist positioning, is the specifically available expression of how constitutionally fundamental the war powers accountability concern truly is across the most ideologically diverse Republican spectrum imaginable. Hawley's crossing is the most dramatically alarming individual crossover signal. His specific character as the most MAGA-aligned Republican senator, whose support for aggressive nationalist positions is the most publicly documented institutional positioning available, makes his war powers vote a thunderclap. It most specifically establishes that the constitutional war powers authority concern transcends the most calcified MAGA loyalty calculation when fundamental congressional military authority is directly and specifically implicated. Hawley crossing on war powers is the most alarming MAGA-aligned crossover, and its specific ideological breadth from Hawley through Paul through the institutionalists is the formally alarming signal of the most realistic future expansion pathway toward the consequentially critical supermajority accountability threshold. The chips away at the aura mechanism analysis forms the second critical analytical dimension. It requires understanding precisely what the specific documented pattern of bipartisan votes against the most aggressive executive orders most specifically means for the fundamental psychological dynamic whose erosion directly enables the most dramatic future congressional accountability action in the urgently pressing second-term context. Every high-profile vote against one of the big moves chips away at the aura that the party will always back him no matter what. That specific analytical characterization is the most precisely available description of the cumulative and self-reinforcing psychological accountability dynamic dynamic. It directly establishes that each specific documented bipartisan vote formally reduces the perceived risk of the next available accountability vote by establishing the available precedent that crossing the president does not automatically produce catastrophic political consequences in the formally documented accountability context. The specific mechanism is the formally available cascade dynamic, where each documented crossover specifically reduces the psychological barrier to the next crossover in a cumulative and self-reinforcing aura erosion process. 12 Republicans crossing on the border emergency made the next Republican crossover psychologically less risky. 5 Republicans crossing on Venezuela war powers compounded that aura erosion. Every additional documented crossover specifically and formally adds to the cumulative psychological erosion of the fundamental party loyalty aura in the formally documented institutional accountability record. The cascade mechanism, making each crossover reduce the psychological risk of the next, is the most important available analytical dimension, and its cumulative self-reinforcing character across the border emergency and war powers documented crossovers is the most alarming signal of progressive aura erosion in existence. The tariff legislation and court decisions working together analysis requires careful treatment as the most specifically available expression of consequential institutional coordination between congressional legislative pressure and judicial accountability determination in the formally alarming combined accountability mechanism. Lawmakers and governors calling for tariff legislation requiring more congressional sign-off, combined with court decisions against tariff schemes working together to undercut the ability to wield economic powers without Congress, is the formally available expression of the most consequential institutional coordination between the legislative and judicial branches in the urgently pressing separation of powers accountability context. The Supreme Court ruling specifically established the formally available constitutional limit on presidential tariff emergency authority through the major questions doctrine. Congressional tariff legislation pressure specifically translates that judicial constitutional limit into the formally available statutory clarification that most directly and permanently closes the creative emergency statute interpretation pathway in the formally consequential legislative accountability format. The governor's calls for refund and legislative action specifically add the state governmental accountability voice to the comprehensively available institutional pressure campaign against the most unlawful presidential economic authority claims. Court decisions plus congressional legislation plus gubernatorial pressure is the comprehensively available institutional coordination signal. Its specific character, involving all 3 most available governmental accountability levels simultaneously, is the formally alarming confirmation of the most broadly coordinated institutional resistance in the credibly documented accountability record. The will they use their tools question is the most forward-looking analytical dimension of this entire narrative. It requires careful treatment as the specifically important open question whose resolution directly determines whether the documented historical pattern of congressional accountability action translates into consequential near-term congressional response to continuing unlawful executive power claims in the urgently pressing second-term accountability context. The big, haunting question is whether Congress will again muster the votes to kill orders it believes cross legal lines, or whether partisan loyalty will allow new, unlawful moves to slide into accepted practice. That specific analytical question most precisely identifies the fundamental tension between the formally documented congressional constitutional authority and the practically available partisan loyalty constraint in the urgently pressing second-term accountability analysis. The documented historical pattern specifically establishes that when enough members unite, Congress can formally kill the most unlawful presidential orders through the most fundamental constitutional mechanisms. But the critically important variable is whether the most available bipartisan coalition can be assembled in the urgently pressing near-term legislative timeframe, given the most acute partisan loyalty enforcement pressures in the formally challenging second-term accountability context. Whether enough members unite is the critically important variable, and the documented historical pattern of 59 border crossovers and 52 war powers crossovers specifically establishes the most realistic precedent for exactly the urgently needed assembly in the consequentially pressing near-term accountability context. Let us crystallize this into clear, concrete reality. I want the full, honest understanding of what the constitutional tools specifically establish about congressional kill authority to sit sit in your mind. I want the chips away at the aura mechanism, what it means for the psychological accountability dynamic, to be unmistakably clear. I want it understood why the ideological breadth of Republican crossovers is the most alarming bipartisan signal available. And I want you laser-focused on what we need to watch as the Congress kills unlawful order saga continues its relentless unfolding. The three formally available congressional constitutional tools, combining the National Emergencies Act, Joint Termination Resolution Mechanism, the Appropriations Clause, Funding Limit Mechanism, and the new statute clarifying legislative authorization mechanism, together specifically establish the most comprehensively available constitutional toolkit. Their specific character as fundamental rather than extraordinary accountability mechanisms directly confirms that Congress has the most readily available formal authority to kill the most unlawful presidential orders when enough members unite in the urgently pressing accountability action. The National Emergencies Act Termination Resolution is the most fundamental available mechanism. The Appropriations Clause funding limit is the most fiscally available mechanism. The new statute authorization clarification is the most broadly available mechanism. The most comprehensively available constitutional toolkit is established. The constitutional tools are fundamental rather than extraordinary mechanisms, and their specific formal availability makes the most consequential congressional kill action the most readily exercisable constitutional authority when enough members unite. The cascade aura erosion mechanism, through which each documented bipartisan crossover specifically reduces the psychological risk of the next available crossover by establishing precedent that crossing does not produce catastrophic political consequences, combined with the cumulative crossovers from 12 on the border emergency through 5 on Venezuela war powers, most precisely establishes the self-reinforcing psychological accountability dynamic. Its progressive erosion directly enables the most dramatic future congressional accountability action in the urgently pressing second-term accountability context. The cascade mechanism reduces the psychological risk of each next crossover. 12 border emergency crossovers establish the most fundamental precedent. 5 Venezuela war powers crossovers compound the aura erosion. The most self-reinforcing psychological accountability dynamic is established. The cascade mechanism is the most important analytical dimension, and the cumulative crossovers from border emergency through war powers establish the most progressively available aura erosion, signaling the most realistic future supermajority assembly pathway. The 5 named Republican Venezuela war powers crossover, spanning from Hawley's nationalist positioning through Paul's libertarian positioning through Young, Murkowski, and Collins's institutionalist positioning, most precisely establishes the most ideologically broad available bipartisan Republican accountability signal. Its specific breadth across the most available Republican ideological spectrum directly confirms that constitutional war powers authority concern transcends the most aggressive MAGA loyalty calculation. This makes Hawley's specific crossing the most alarming available individual signal of the most realistic future Republican accountability expansion. Hawley's nationalist crossing is the most alarming individual signal. Paul's libertarian crossing is the most ideologically consistent. Young, Murkowski, and Collins's institutionalist crossing is the most institutionally expected. Together, they span the most ideologically broad range available. The most realistic future expansion is established. The ideological breadth from Hawley to the institutionalists is the most alarming bipartisan signal, and Hawley's specific nationalist crossing is the dramatically alarming individual confirmation that constitutional authority concern transcends partisan loyalty calculation. Here is exactly what we need to watch as the Congress kills unlawful order story continues its relentless march forward, because several specific developments will most directly signal whether the documented historical accountability pattern is translating into the most consequential near-term congressional action. Watch the Iran war powers vote attempts for any signals that the 47 to 48 near misses are approaching the 51 majority threshold in ways that directly translate the documented near-miss trajectory into formally available majority passage in the consequentially critical war powers constitutional accountability dimension. Watch for any additional Republican crossovers beyond the documented 5 Venezuela defectors for signals that the available bipartisan coalition is expanding toward the most realistic supermajority pathway in the urgently pressing accountability context. Watch the tariff legislation progress for any formal congressional action, specifically clarifying the statutory authorization requirements for Presidential Emergency Economic Authority in ways that directly and permanently close the creative emergency statute interpretation pathway in the formally consequential legislative accountability format. And watch the funding limit deployment for any signals that congressional appropriations riders or continuing resolution conditions are being specifically weaponized to directly deny the fundamental funding required for the most unlawful executive order implementation in the formally available appropriations clause accountability mechanism. So here is the absolute bottom line, and I want every ounce of it carried forward. 59 senators voted to terminate the border wall national emergency declaration, with 12 Republicans joining all Democrats, forcing a presidential veto in the most formally documented bipartisan congressional emergency termination accountability action in modern memory. The documented 5 Republican Venezuela war powers, crossover spanning from Hawley through Paul through Young, Murkowski, and Collins, producing a 52-47 passage, is the most specifically authenticated bipartisan war powers accountability break in the formally documented institutional record. Iran war powers resolutions reached 47 to 48 near misses, establishing the most urgently pressing near threshold proximity in the consequentially available war powers accountability dimension. Lawmakers and governors combine legislative pressure with court decisions against illegal tariff schemes to specifically undercut the ability to wield economic powers without Congress in the most comprehensively available institutional coordination signal. The cascade aura erosion mechanism through which each documented crossover reduces the psychological risk of the next, specifically establishes the most self-reinforcing available accountability dynamic whose cumulative erosion directly enables the most dramatic future congressional accountability action. The 3 formally available constitutional tools of termination resolution, funding limit, and new statute specifically confirm that Congress has the most readily available formal authority to kill the most unlawful presidential orders when enough members unite. 59 border emergency votes documented, 52 Venezuela war powers documented, 47 Iran near-miss documented, Hawley's crossing authenticated, constitutional tools formally available. The Trump power ends after Congress kills unlawful orders story is the most specifically alarming and the most comprehensively documented real-world expression of what it means for fundamental congressional constitutional authority to be specifically and formally exercised through documented bipartisan coalitions, killing the most unlawful presidential emergency declarations and war powers claims in the most formally authenticated and credibly sourced separation of powers accountability record of the modern congressional resistance era. We are going to be right here, watching every single development as the Congress kills unlawful order story continues its relentless march toward its most consequential accountability outcomes.